and welcome to another episode of MMT Mondays. Today, I'm going to explain how both Democrats, Republicans, and the mainstream media lie to us about federal money, but also how one congressman had the courage to speak out about how we can use our sovereign fiat currency to build a more just nation. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe, and let's get to it. I remember when I first started learning about MMT, one of the first major alterations I had to change in my mind was that the federal government's finances were not like my own. I had grown up knowing that I must balance what I spend versus the amount of money that I make. The federal government is not like a regular fiscal house, yet repeatedly deficit hawks use the same old tropes about the taxpayer dollars to scare people into supporting austerity measures. Take, for instance, this recent interview with Congressman Kevin Buzz Killington Hearn.
We spend $1 trillion a year right now on programs to help those who can't help themselves, that need help, need a handout. Many of us in America, myself included, early on in life, needed that help. But we also ought to be helping those folks move on to jobs. And so the American Jobs Plan, as the president has pushed, and the American Family Plan, as you just referenced, American Family Plan is over $4 trillion of spending. The American Jobs Plan that was just pushed forward is over $1.5 trillion. And so when you look at these two programs together, along with some other things going on, we're talking about a $6 trillion budget. And the American taxpayer has just said enough is enough. Even Democrats now are sending letters to the leaders of both the House and the Senate saying, we have got to get our fiscal house in order.
Now, besides being about as enjoyable as nails on a chalkboard, Representative Hearn continues to claim that Americans have had enough of major spending. This is about as asinine as the belief that taxes fund federal spending. Americans overwhelmingly and across the political divide support major spending efforts to modernize and revitalize our energy system and turn our economy into a green and equitable system. For the last 150 years, we have suffered through dog whistle politics of the taxpayer that stood in the way of achieving racial and economic justice. Representative Hearn once again relies on the latest iteration of the supremacy of elites in order to prevent bold, transformative progressive policies. Representative John Yarmuth of Kentucky responded beautifully to Hearn by calling out the hypocrisy in Congress and the mainstream media. When asked the age-old deflection question of, how are you going to afford it? Yarmuth explained that the federal government determines how much money is in the system because we are the issuer of currency, not the user. Yarmuth even goes on to explain how the chairman of the Federal Reserve admitted that we have the fiscal space to make significant investments in federal spending. Overall, Yarmuth highlights the view that Congress should be asking what does American people need us to do and not what can we afford.
So, Chair Yarmuth, how can we spend $6 trillion and all the other money that President Biden wants to spend? How can we afford it?
We can't afford it because we determine how much money's in the system and at the federal level. The federal government is not like any other user of currency, not like any household, any business, any state or local government. We issue our own currency, and we can spend enough to meet the needs of the American people. The only constraint being that we do have to worry about inflation from that spending. Now, so many people say, well, we've got so much debt and our grandchildren are going to have, it's going to be on their backs and so forth. That's not the way it works. And I think the American people need an education about how the monetary system does work. I remember going back, Greta, to when Paul Ryan was chair of the Budget Committee, and even before that, and all of these forecasts of gloom and doom about, we're going to accumulate so much debt and interest rates are going to crowd out all other spending. Well, we basically doubled the national debt from the recession in 2009 until last year before the pandemic. And none of the things that people warned what happened. We didn't have inflation. We had record low interest rates rather than higher interest rates, and the dollar was trading within normal levels vis-a-vis other currencies. So I think a lot of economists now have begun to say, wait a minute, maybe we've been thinking about debt in entirely the wrong way. And even Fed Chair Jay Powell has basically said, we have the fiscal space to do what we need to do right now, to make the investments we need to make to build the kind of economy for the future that we all hope we'll have.
Well, why are people wrong about this, and how should we be thinking about debt and deficits?
Well, I don't get any royalties from this, but I would flog a book called The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton, an economist and professor. And it's become quite a bestseller, actually. And what she says is that if you look at the total national debt, $28 trillion right now is what we think of as the national debt. She said, don't think of it as debt. Think of it as all the money that the federal government has invested in the country over our history minus taxes. And that's really what it is. I mean, those $28 trillion didn't exist before the federal government issued them. And so the federal government has the ability to create money, create financing, and that's what we've been doing, we'll continue to do. The thing that I am so impressed about from the Biden administration is that they're reversing decades and decades of our asking questions in the wrong order. Historically, what we've always done is said, what can we afford to do? And that's not the right question. The right question is, what do the American people need us to do? And that question becomes the first question. Once you've answered that, then you say, how do you resource that need? And that's not just money, that's also capacity. So, for instance, there's a $225 billion investment in child care in the American Families Plan. But you can't just say we're going to give $225 billion to people to pay for their child care because there's not enough capacity. So what you do is you'd make a false promise to the people, and then you would drive the price of existing child care even higher. So what you have to do is spend part of that money on building capacity so that there's enough child care to actually service the people who need it. So again, they're just very different ways of thinking about money, and I understand why most people don't understand this concept, because they think of it in their own framework, which is their household, which is you can't borrow so much money that you can't pay back. But that's not the position that the federal government's in.
Congressman, are you saying we can just print more money and there's no consequences?
There could be consequences if there is too much inflation. So let me give you a hypothetical. We could say that we're going to give every American family a $200,000 voucher to buy a house. We could create the money to do that. But what would happen? Well, there's not enough housing, so the prices of existing houses would go through the roof, no pun intended. And again, you'd be creating a false promise, but meanwhile, you drive up the housing market to unsustainable levels. So there is a limit as to how much money we can inject into the economy. The thing about the rescue plan, and here's where I think Kevin Hearn makes a mistake, is he said $6 trillion American Families Plan and Job Plan. It's not quite that much, but that's over 8 to 10 years. So the $6 trillion budget that the president proposed actually would have been $5.7 trillion if you had no American Jobs Plan or American Rescue Plan, because only $300 billion of that is in fiscal year 22. So again, you've got to realize these are numbers that are very large, of course, but they're spread out over a number of years. And that's why I think the Fed chair and others have said we have the fiscal space to do this, because injecting this over a period of time will not cause the kind of inflation that is dangerous.
As Chairman Yarmuth so clearly pointed out, according to Stephanie Kelton's bestseller, The Deficit Myth, inequality and poverty are political choices, since we can easily afford to end them. So what is the best way to approach transforming our society into a more equitable one? On a recent episode of Macro and Cheese, Professor Fadl Kaboub came on to discuss how instead of pushing for single progressive plans such as a federal job guarantee, Medicare for all, or a Green New Deal one at a time, we should take a layer cake approach. Professor Kaboub explains that the progressive movement has been so incredibly beaten down that we have been reduced to only hoping to get crumbs at a time. This only serves to hurt us more in the long term. Tackling one policy at a time or taking a state-by-state approach places the programs and citizens in a precarious position since states are not issuers of their own currency. Instead, Professor Kaboub views a Green New Deal as a 3-layer cake. He views the first foundational layer of the cake being guaranteeing universal basic services such as health, education, green infrastructure, and universal childcare. The second layer includes a federally funded job guarantee program that provides a living wage and full benefits to workers who cannot find employment in the private sector. His third and final layer involves a generous income support for people who can't work or shouldn't work for health reasons or for other reasons overall. Kaboub concludes that this layered approach assures that we truly can create a prosperous society that has the right priorities and is not leaving anyone behind.
And in a panel you and I were on the other day regarding the federal job guarantee, what you did was absolutely masterful, and I'm hoping that we can get you to recreate that for this podcast. You made the mention of why the Green New Deal is a layer cake, if you will. It's a bundle, and it has to come that way because each thing builds off the other. Could you describe the progressive layer cake for the Green New Deal, Medicare for all, job guarantee, just transition, and explain the funding mechanism and why that matters?
Absolutely. Happy to do that. To answer your question, and this is very important because many people in the progressive movement have been beaten down so badly and have lost hope in having something truly transformative. And we've kind of bifurcated our efforts into trying to fight for little bits and pieces that some people are hoping to accomplish at the local level and hoping that eventually the federal forces will take shape. So this analytical lens that we're putting on the table, the modern monetary theory perspective, makes a few observations and a few recommendations. The observations are very simple, that the federal government is the sovereign issue of the currency. It's not constrained in the same way as you and I are constrained or states and municipalities are constrained. You and I have to work hard, earn an income first in order to spend. We can borrow up to a certain limit, but beyond that, we have to live within our means, so to speak. And the same is true for states and municipalities. They can tax their local residents. They can borrow up to a certain limit. But beyond that, they have to tighten their belts and balance their budgets and pay down their debts. So the federal government doesn't operate in that space. The federal government is not constrained by tax revenues or borrowing capacity. The federal government is constrained ultimately in terms of its spending capacity by the risk of inflation. And the risk of inflation from an MMT perspective comes from two things. One is the shortage or lack of productive capacity. In other words, when we ran out of skilled people, machinery, equipment, resources, if we decide to spend more beyond our capacity, then there is a risk of inflation. And the good news about that risk of inflation is that we know how to deal with it. With strategic investments in education and infrastructure and technical skills, we can increase our productive capacity and mitigate that risk of inflation with strategic planning and create millions of jobs doing that and create millions of green jobs. The second source of the risk of inflation, which is something that brings me closer to the world of Bill Black, is the abusive market power that some key players have in this economy. Think of the pricing power of pharmaceuticals, the pricing power of your telecom companies, of the energy companies, oil and gas companies, the Wall Street companies, and so on. And that kind of inflation price-setting power that they have can't be eliminated with austerity, can't be eliminated by spending less or by balancing budgets. It can only be eliminated when you tax and regulate their market power out of existence by implementing or enforcing antitrust laws, by going after corruption, essentially. So those are the real constraints for the economy. Now, if we understand that, if we put this lens for the general public to see the world of possibilities, then we realize who's truly standing in the way of Medicare for all, of a job guarantee, of clean investments and green investments and so on. It's not the lack of money that we have access to at the federal level. Then we recognize that it's not really possible for states and municipalities to do all of this transformative stuff. It's really the federal government that has those capabilities. And now, if we believe in the true meaning of democracy, a government of the people, by the people, for the people, then we demand that the 535 people we elect in DC, that they do their job, which is to spend on the national priorities and tax and regulate market power out of existence. Now, spending on national priorities, once we understand this, then here I'm coming to the answer to your question, Steve, which is the 3 layers of the cake as you described it. And this is what the Green New Deal is for me. Number 1, we know that we should and we can afford spending on universal public services, health, education, green infrastructure, universal childcare, you name it. A country like the United States can afford all of those priorities. And we design the implementation programs for these with job trainings and education and the right investments for infrastructure. Fully funded at the federal level, not a burden on states and municipalities and local residents. The second layer becomes a job guarantee for people who can't find work in the private sector or in the mainline government sector as described in the first layer, and a job guarantee at decent wages and benefits. And then the third layer is generous income support for people who can't work or shouldn't work for health reasons or other reasons. In this way, you're truly creating a prosperous society that has the right priorities and is not leaving anybody behind. So this way, once we understand the power of the federal government to do this, then we should look back at everything we've been doing, shifting all of these burdens and responsibilities on individuals who can't afford it and therefore end up in neglect, and states and municipalities who, by definition, don't have the resources and must race to the bottom to attract a little bit more business, either from fracking companies or pipeline companies or Amazon headquarters or whatever you can get. But that's clearly not a universal solution you can implement across the country. And that's what creates this intensifying dynamic of inequality. And a lot of this inequality is racially infused. And as a result, we have what we have today. So what the MMT perspective does, it shines this bright light on the existing dynamic, and it shows that we have a whole world of possibilities, and at the same time identifies who's standing in the way, be it corporate power or corrupt politicians who have abdicated their power, the power of the purse of the federal government, and are asking local states and municipalities to do this. And then to zoom in on the particular job guarantee piece that you wanted to discuss, Steve, that highlights why we need the whole package, why we can't just do the job guarantee and ignore all the other work that we've been talking about. One of the immediate reactions to the idea of the job guarantee, or a couple of the immediate reactions, will be, number 1, the cost is too expensive. Number 2, for small businesses, they're going to say, well, if you offer a job guarantee that pays a living wage plus benefits plus all of these perks, how can I, as a small business, compete with them? Maybe Amazon can compete. Maybe Walmart can compete. They'll just trim their profit margins at the top and CEO pay and all of that, and they can actually afford it. But for small businesses, it's true. For many, will struggle to compete immediately with the $15 minimum wage or $25 minimum wage plus benefits and so on. And this is where you start looking carefully at the burden that small businesses are facing. Quite a bit of it is actually the cost of healthcare that they have to pay, and the employees also have to pay out of pocket. The burden of FICA taxes on small businesses. From an MMT perspective, we know that the federal government can afford a much more generous Social Security, retirement benefits, healthcare, retirement benefits for everybody, and doesn't really need the tax for it. So this is where you can start arguing for a job guarantee and Medicare for all at the same time, because you can't do one without the other. You have to start unpacking now all the other problems that people who would actually benefit from a job guarantee at the local level, especially in rural areas, will tell you, well, it's great, we have a job guarantee and we have a living wage, but there's no transportation, but there's no childcare, but there's no elderly care, but I'm struggling with a mental health addiction. How do you want me to take advantage of a job guarantee that offers all these great benefits if it doesn't include mental health benefits? So this means that you have to have Medicare for all as part of a jobs package. You can't shift that burden on individuals or businesses or shove it under the rug as if it doesn't exist. So that's why the whole package of a Green New Deal is the transformative thing we've been looking for to address all of these problems simultaneously. Because creating a job doesn't mean that somebody can take that job and push a pause button on their mental health issue, on their transportation problems, on their childcare problems, and wait for another 5 years for somebody to figure out a solution. All of these things need to happen at the same time.
As you can see, both Congressman Yarmuth and Professor Kaboub show us that we have the financial means and the human ingenuity to achieve a more equitable and just society. Rather than building a more prosperous society up until now, those in power have chosen to cause millions to suffer under neoliberal austerity politics. By shifting all of these burdens and responsibilities on individuals who can't afford it, the results are neglect and near bankruptcy for states and municipalities who, by definition, don't have the resources to make it happen. The states subsequently race to the bottom in order to hopefully attract a little bit more business and gain a tax base. This option results in intensified levels of racially infused inequality that we see today. So that's why this layer cake package of a Green New Deal is the transformative thing that we've been looking for to address all of these different issues simultaneously. All of these things need to happen at the same time. Otherwise, we end up automatically excluding people who can't be a part of this transformative effort because we're telling them that we're only going to give you one slice of the cake at a time. If you enjoyed tonight's video, make sure to check us out at realprogressives.org and subscribe to get notifications on new video streams in YouTube, Periscope, Facebook, Twitch, and Rockfin. Also, though, if you want to support the work that we do at Real Progressives, make sure to check out our Patreon page, where for only a few bucks a month, you can support our endeavors. Thank y'all, and have a great week.